Hey,
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Language of Creation Book Club. And we have a full screen-ish right now, so that's good. We're all on time, even though there's issues with the planning because of time zones. Um, so yeah, let's get back into it. I was just thinking before we started off about the setting of the intention for the week, how how bad I am in actually following up on that. Uh, like it's hard enough to have an intention in the book club and and be with it, let alone for a whole week. But I just read back what the intention was, or at least the thing that came out for me, and it was in relationship to offices. Um, So this idea of that an office is occupied by something, and there's a distance between the person occupying the office and um, and the role of the office. And as you can read, my intention this week is about domains and dominion. Um, And this is kind of related to an office, right? Because like what is a domain? Well, a domain is something which is ruled over, right? So it's something that's assigned to something else, or unified under something. Um, and a dominion is in that in which you something rules at least, right? Something has say, can speak for. Um, and the reason that I came to this intention is I was reading, and I noticed that Matthieu Pageau was sometimes using different words, uh, more modern words, or the way Mark would say it, maybe more flat words. um, and then I was thinking, like, what's happening here? Um, I also had an experience going to a Lutheran church, and I got talked about. Uh, they talked about Heidegger and Wittgenstein, and I'm like, why are we talking about these things in the church? Like what do they have to say about what's their domain of expertise? What's their dominion, right? And so I'm I'm looking for like what's happening there, right? Because what's happening is there's a misapplication or misappropriation of some term, right? And the use for the term, right? And that also means that you get a misapprehension. You can't hold on to something, right? So if we try to get a grip on the world, right, and this is what philosophers try to do, and all the people who want to do something, and even Mathieu Pageau, because he's trying to write a book and he's trying to communicate a message, right? So if we're in that modality, like we are gonna use things that allow us to have a grip, right? Which means that we're also not focusing on the things that disallow us to have a grip, right? Like where the ambiguity is, like the ineffability, right? The miraculous, enchanted nature of being. Uh, that's not useful. like like it's anti-useful to have uh, in, inaccurate or imprecise descriptions. And and so yeah, like I think that's just part of part of the game. Like it's just if you're in something, uh, then that makes you reach for certain tools that allow you to do what you want to do. And like I just put out a tweet, right? Like people are they're not sense making, but I lost the word. But they're seeking for a path. Oh yeah, they're seeking for a path, not a pattern, right? So there's a pattern, right, which is a way in which something is, right? It's a type of being, and the path is something that you follow, right? That you use to get somewhere. Um, and if you're pathfinding, like you can go to Peterson, right? Like things get revealed in a certain manner, and things will be placed in a manner that they make sense to you, and they get organized as their use, right? As their appropriate participation in the path, in the purpose that you set yourself. So um, that was hopefully something that we can all keep in the back of our minds during the book club. But it's specifically my intention to seek out. Okay, like what are these domains that are classified where things have dominion, where ideas have dominion, and if you take them out of the domain, they might have a revelatory quality, right? So they can point at something, but they're no longer accurate. They're no longer a correct description or a correct relationship at that level of analysis. Um, so that's my intention. That's also the way that my intention snuck back into my week, even though it wasn't planned, which is maybe the better way. Like a lot of things are happening for me that aren't planned, but they're still participating. So that's just great. Gustav, you can go next.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. My intention is pretty simple. I think I've been waiting for a while or working for a while for something to kind of to crystallize, to gain a bit more well, my intention says working for clarity. Like I just want something like a strong foundation uh in this messy world. Um and something I can kind of build on a little bit more. Yeah, and I'll know it when I see it or when you see it, maybe. I don't know. So, yeah. Christopher, can you go next?
Yeah, I've written here attending to higher space because it's easier for me to get bogged down in looking at low level details, whatever, and get distracted by that and lose focus on the telos of whatever's happening. And so how I can, and just figuring out how I can, participate well towards the telos instead of just the minutia that is right in front of me, or seems like it is when I'm looking right at it. Danny, want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I really liked how Manuel framed things about dominion and getting a grip and seeking a path versus or a pattern, looking for a pattern versus following a path, and what Gustavo said about a foundation to stand on. Last 3 weeks or something, Manuel and I have kind of hung out afterwards, and we've been talking about one of the themes we've been talking about is basically making practical decisions in a kind of a pluralistic world, and what are some of the more minimalistic things that to agree upon with people. As the book content of the book is kind of getting into Adam, like the flesh and the bones, it's kind of getting kind of into more of a lower level in my eyes, in my mind, physical. Um, and I think when kind of looking at your life experience at the lower level, the idea of being under the grip of something or under the dominion of things that are larger than you is like, I mean, for me, it happens all day, every day. I mean, maybe not most of the days, but when I look at, you know, what actually moves me to behave, I'm constantly under the dominion of, you know, of things that are, it's important to, I guess, you know, see clearly. So I've been recently, I've just been challenging a lot of my long-standing habits, and like even things as simple as eating meat. Like I've done that my entire life. I'm just trying to see when I do things, how does it make me feel? So that's kind of where my headspace is, and I'll be looking at this book through that lens, in these chapters. Elena.
My intention is kind of similar to what it was last week, since we didn't get to the chapter, but trying to understand how everybody else sees the microcosm of the garden within a person, and how if if they do relate to that and see it within themselves, just so I can start figuring out how to do that for myself. Cassie, you want to go?
So as promised last week, I had to go with self-similar fractal as my title there, as ridiculous as I could do. Also, it's been happening a lot, so I've been thinking a lot about microcosms, not even thinking about that was my intention. I actually forgot it for all the way up until today. But I'm just seeing a lot of this kind of recurring stuff. I was thinking a lot about, we kind of briefly touched on last week, this sort of thing of like, you have the completeness, like the circular completeness, and then you have the very rigid kind of 90-degree angle, square straightness. And then this aspect of, not only do you have those things one inside of the other, but a lot of times you have the sort of self-similar fractal, you know, situation going on there, where you have them just stacking all the way down, alternating. And there was an animation I did a while back that I was too lazy to send, but it was essentially that sort of thing happening. And so I was thinking about this thing, and a little bit in relation to what Manuel was kind of talking about, of this thing of like reaching for things outside of the domain, or like when is it appropriate to take like tools that are outside the door, you know, and kind of integrate those when you already have a tool set. Like, is it not appropriate to use the things that you already have? You know, and are you unnecessarily complicating things? And also thinking of this thing of, you know, I heard a great line that this is with respect to like art, but also even anything like, you know, sportsmanship or any of these other types of crafts, that they said advanced techniques are just rookie mistakes done on purpose. And you have that sort of thing of you know, you see those ridiculous pictures of like the bell curve, you know, and it shows the person, it's like a caveman or something like that, and then there's a person in the middle that has a completely different perspective, and then the extremely far end of the bell curve, really smart guy, comes to the same conclusion as the caveman, you know. And it's the sort of thing of like, okay, the first one did it by mistake and still managed to get it right. It was using the tools within the domain and still got the right answer. And then there's the other person that has been there, done that, and still came back, but they're doing it intentionally. And they know what the implications are of doing the outside and inside stuff. They understand the rules and know how to break it. And in the end, wind up kind of doing the so-called rookie mistakes on purpose without injuring themselves, or, you know, to the proper effect. And so just kind of stewing a lot of those things around, thinking about them. I don't have any conclusions, but hopefully some of that informs the way I engage with the book here. And then I'll greet our newcomer as well. I hope I don't butcher your name, Aditya. Would you mind?
Yeah, that's okay, Aditya. But you could call me Addy if you like. That's okay as well.
Thank you.
Well, this is my first time here. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to have found this book club. I was looking to be a part of something like this for a while, so I'm glad to be here. And just to briefly elucidate or share what I've been thinking about today, it is this. I've thought about what freedom means for a while, and I used to think that to be free is to be conscious. In some sense, I used to think that to be free is to be conscious of every decision you make and to steer your life accordingly. But lately, I've been sort of experimenting with the idea that freedom might be harmonizing with the subconscious, with the unconscious, and because the subconscious is the seat of reality, and it is only when you let your subconscious constitute reality? Do you give yourself a world in which you can act? So that's what I've been thinking about, and I think that plays well. That relates to a certain extent with this book, insofar as it is about regaining a lost sense of reality that we lose precisely insofar as we become scientific. So yeah.
Yeah, I want to introduce you to way we're handling things here. So you can see that we have below a lane, we have a description.
Uh-huh.
So we try and set an intention
Okay.
for the book club, and it's there in some sense to remind ourselves, like, okay, like this is the way that I'm participating, and that allows us to be intentional in the way that we're relating, and it allows us to pick up certain things, especially the things that we struggle with or that we're trying to explore. So that's one of the things that we're trying to relate to the book with, and you can also look at yourself, right? You can see that you're on a path. If you look back and you look at your intentions, they're following each other, right? There's a sequence there, and that allows for a different type of participation, right? It allows for growth, cultivation. So when we're talking about having a relationship to ourselves, it's like, okay, like there's also an aspirational aspect, like who do we want to be, where are we going? So I would like to invite you to partake in that process and figure out an intention for yourself, and you can start easy. I can even give you one, all right? Um, so
Sure.
so the
Uh-huh.
intention I would invite you to engage with is kind of what Elena was talking about. She's saying like we're trying to figure out. She's trying to figure out like how do the other people relate, right? Like where are they coming from? And when you start looking for where other people are coming from, you can also recognize where you're coming from, right? And like how you're different. And then it's like, oh, I don't know why I'm different. Like, why am I doing it this way? Like, is there actually a good reason for that, or is that just an assumption that's baked in the cake? Um, so that might be a good first intention for you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
Mark, you want to go?
Sure. So, yeah, I guess in a way we're at the self-similar fractal part of the book. Yay, finally. And because of the research I'm doing for reasons, what's been occurring to me is the link between self-similar practicality and what John Vervaeke calls relevance realization, right? And then you're going to see, coming up in the book, all of this stuff around identifying the pattern, the smaller pattern, and how it's related to the larger pattern, right? And so my intention is to keep in mind how that sort of plays out the problem for me is just it's always been this way. So it's like, I don't know why you have to explain this to anybody. So the intent for me is to figure out how to explain where this came up last night on my live stream too, right? Like how do you not see this? I don't understand. Like, so how do you explain the self-similar fractal? Like, no, this thing at the national level and this thing at the local level, this thing happening in your family are all actually the same thing. There might be different people involved or whatever, different motivations involved, but the pattern's identical, right? And so that level of, this is somewhat an unfair way to frame it, of compression about sense making is really helpful, because science just explodes things to too many variables fairly quickly. That's sort of the edge of materialism. That's why it fails. But this intuitive, poetic way of informing the world, as we like to call it, that just allows for this easy way to see that. So my intention is, hopefully Mature is going to help me with this quite a bit, although I've already read this previously, and I don't think I was paying the right kind of attention.
hopefully let me find ways to exemplify this and show it to people better than I did last night on my stream, for example. So that's my intention, just to see this more and figure out ways to explain it and see what aspects people are missing.
Yeah, so like has been mentioned, we're at part 4 of the book, Time and Space on the Human Scale. So the 2 previous scales we've been engaging with were the cosmic scale and then like 1 level below it, I guess, which has like the fact that I have to say I guess means that there's a bunch of confusion around that. So, but it's going to be more explicit, which is hopefully yeah, going to be helpful, right? And to go back to the domain thing, I think we want to place everything in in the proper domain. So we actually went into the first page of chapter 53 already last week, a little bit. So I want to open it, I guess, for the people who weren't there or the people who actually found things to add onto what we talked about.
I just, because I wasn't here, unfortunately, and it doesn't relate to 53 necessarily, although it actually does, but different problem. That was great, book club, by the way. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. But the one thing that I thought might be helpful is to understand that with Nebuchadnezzar's statue, I know Castle did a pretty good job of talking about the emanation, but you build the clay feet first. Everything comes up from the bottom towards the intention of the emanation of the gold. So yeah, you always talk about the emanation first. I think that's our big flaw in the scientism, materialist garbage world. You always want to talk about the telos, to Christopher's excellent point, the telos, the emanation first, and then you want to talk about, well, but it's supported from these clay feet, right? And then it gets refined as it goes up. And those are just the only 2 points that I thought, I don't think anybody made them, or maybe they didn't make them well enough for my scattered brain at the time. I listened to the book club driving down from New England the other day, so I'm not remembering clearly with my cold and everything else. But I wanted to point that out. And then I think if you go to the first page of chapter 53, this is the diagram of self-similar fractality. That's what this is, all right? It shows the process, how we started out from a very simple, we'll call it a single unity, I guess, right, which is the circle called creator. And then we get a differentiation. And then we don't get a new differentiation. What we get is a self-similar fractal pattern, right? And so that's not a differentiation, right? And that, I think, goes back to, Manuel, your dominion. Like, how do we recognize dominion? Well, you recognize dominion in recognizing the proper, I think Jordan Peterson might call it something like layer of analysis. So the problem that we have in materialism is you can make up layers of analysis on the fly, right? And they're almost all invalid, right? Which is not to say they're not useful, right? Because those are different things. You can find a use for most things. Also, don't do that. Like, don't just seek to find usefulness everywhere. Instead, seek to find this fractal pattern so that you know where dominion is, right? Because the dominion is in the repeat of the pattern. And that'll help you, give you the proper relationship to the king, which helps to give you the proper relationship to God, which helps to give you the proper relationship to your family, up and down, vertical causality. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to preface this with, just because I saw this and I was like, oh yeah, there's your self-similar fractal coming into being, if you will, if you want to get metaphysical or existential on it. And that was the significant part for me about this particular page.
Yeah, so I want to go ahead and jump a little bit ahead, but I think it's important to add on to it, right? So we're going to talk about exile from the garden. And I was talking with Gustav earlier, like what does it mean to be exiled, right? That means to be placed outside, right? So you have a center and then you have more. And if you're in the center, you don't have to account for the more, right? So what does it mean to be exiled? It means that you need to integrate more. And so that's also a way in which the practicality grows, right? Like it adds onto itself, right? And then there's a new domain that gets started, right? Like the promised land, right? So there's and there's covenants with God, right? Like so they're dogmas, right? Like they're things that are making a space, right? A new space within which stability can manifest and things can be established. And so then you get another manifestation of the fractal, right? So I think that is something to keep in mind, right? Because I think that's the project of the Bible, at least in Genesis and Exodus. It's like, okay, like where and how do they get established, and what are the problems that occur when you do that? And we will get into curses and blessings, right? So the blessing is the establishment of structure, and the curse is the loss of structure, right? And there's different curses as a consequence of different loss of structure. So
that was one thing I noticed here, is that what you were just talking there, it goes back to in chapter 2 of this book here, he has the diagram with the eye in the garden, and then with it going into exile with it on the periphery. That's like all the way back in chapter 2.
Oh, okay. I'm not gonna go.
Yeah. Don't scroll back that far. But that's where he goes, because you have the view, like the stable view within space, and then the wandering view within time here. And that's kind of what he's been going over with the contrasting those two perspectives, and how you mediate and maybe integrate both of them into the more.
So
Right.
something I'm thinking about with respect to everything that just got mentioned within the last like 10 minutes or so is something that came up in last week's book club was this thing of like the going west to find your roots, or like going into exile to kind of get down to basics, or get down to the roots for the purpose of growth and like greater integration. And I'm thinking about this also within the kind of frame that I had as my intention, this thing of you could use the example of training anything. Again, like if it's music, you're practicing scales or something, or if you're doing martial arts, like you're practicing a technique over and over and over again. It's like, when do I get to do the thing that I want to do? When do I get to the promised land? It's just like, oh yeah, I could go out and do this thing badly, but also I want to do it well. When do I get? It's like, no, you get to sit in a room and just do this over and over and over again in like a holding pattern, in a sense, just repeating the same cycle over and over and over again for the purpose of growth and integration. And then that's where you're kind of having this thing of like, yeah, you can just go out and do it and then fail, and it's like, that's fine. Like that's sort of the caveman thing. Or you can kind of be like, oh, I'm just going to do the practice over and over again and then never actually apply it. I'm just going to have all this information and then do nothing with it. And then there's the actual, now I'm going to actually go out and apply it now that I have these things. And then, now that I've received wisdom, I'm going to go out and get understanding, or, practical experience with that. And so I was just kind of saying that with respect to that sort of pattern of like, starting in and then having to go out to kind of increase, also thinking of that sort of thing. We'll be talking a little bit here of we talked already a little bit about like the spiral of kind of like the what is it, that symbol of the of like the medical system or something, where it's the snakes wrapped around the rod, that you have this sort of thing of like going out and then back around, and then just it's simultaneously going around, but it's also going out and then back in over and over again, almost like a stitching of sorts. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was also thinking, just a quick little response to something that Mark said. I was thinking about this. I actually had this on my mind for like days, because I'm thinking of a way to communicate it to other people. Like, I've got the image, but this is helpful. So this thing of right here on this page, you have the single unity, and then you have the differentiation, and then you have the self-similar fractal. And I was thinking about that with respect to, there's this big debate that for some reason keeps popping up, and it's the thing of like the word father in the Bible pops up, and people get all upset about some of its applications. And one of the things I found out, and this is something that Mark has said just within the last week about, words in Greek often, like depending on its, and the same in Hebrew, like depending on its context, completely changes definition. But also you can have just like a couple of letters difference in any language really, and there's an enormous difference in implication of what that actually applies to. So something, you could look at in Greek, the word patera would be applied to creator as like father as such, not even the pattern or differentiation of fatherhood, just the very kind of the single unity of father is patera. And then you have patria, which is where like patriotism and that type of thing comes from. So you got the differentiation of that. And then you have every single self-similar fractal manifestation of that differentiation at all the different scales. And like there is no sort of conflict in between those. So that was something I have to try to explain without upsetting some college students in like 4 days. And so I'm just kind of working through that, but I just want to say thank you. That was what was on my mind.
Yeah, that is great. I want to pull in this from RJ, right? So yeah, I think it's correct, right? So there's something about exile that you're past the point of no return, right? And like that has to do with virginity as well, right? Like when you lose your virginity, like now you have to establish something new, right? But the thing that this brought up in me is that if you're exiled, you're still identified against the old. Like you're still in relationship to where you came from, right? And I think the promised land, right, is basically the statement of hope of a promise of a future, right? So that you can orient out of circling around your past, because that's the self-referential aspect, right? Like if you just keep circling around what already is or was or has been, you can't. You need to escape from that, right? You need to find escape velocity. And I don't know, Mark, this crazy word that we found today. Like I think it is actually having to do with this, like the ability to escape your frame in some sense, right?
Right. Well, it was more related to relevance realization directly, but yeah, it comes closer to the objective materiality. It's not even a word, right? It's actually an acronym, a poorly constructed one. But I also want to highlight, and hey RJ, good to see you. Hop on in. This relates exactly to what you were saying about structure, right? Because one aspect of structure is the container, and one aspect of a container is, we'll say, the ability to have a starting point and to have a destination, right? Like that defines a domain. The container defines a domain. Another way to think about exile is being thrown into a flood of potential, right? And then sure, anything could happen. Also, most things aren't good, and you can't even use direction, and maybe not even orientation, right? And so you have to find a way to reorient yourself when you're in exile, and that is all about the personal sacrifice of whatever put you there effectively, right? And that's how you get out of exile, right? Is you fulfill the promise, right? And so it was promised to you, but like what do you have to do? Like promises are never like one way. Oh, I'm gonna give you the world for free no matter what. Like, no, that's not how that works. And so the fact that you're in exile means you haven't fulfilled your end of the bargain effectively, right? You haven't fulfilled your end of the promise. And that's why you end up with having nowhere to return to, because you've already left and no destination to reach. It's not that it's not there, it's that you're not willing to well, Peterson would say look low enough or something, right? But I like the sacrifice term a bit better there. You're not willing to sacrifice what you have to get what was promised, and that I think is all. So you can hopefully I didn't make a mess of that. I'm sick, so I sound brilliant in my head, which is great for me, and probably sucks for the rest of you. So hopefully you can see how all that sort of coalesces and comes together. And, maybe Cass will yell at me later on the Discord server. I don't know.
I think another way to think of exile is that to place it in the diagram that's come up a couple times of the diseased limb, of the diseased member inside a body, is that when you get exiled, you kind of are that diseased member. Like you're sort of in relation to the whole, but you're not really part of it. Perhaps you're hindering it. Like maybe you've been cut off, and then you kind of have this hope of being reoriented towards a purpose, perhaps a new purpose, perhaps the old one, but within a new body. And that integration, I think, is that entering of the promised land. And maybe that means that you're the one that has to change. Maybe it means that the larger body has to change. But
I'll help you definitely for both.
yeah. Well, but it has to do with communion, I think, as well, with the larger world, with reality. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that change is inevitable, right? Like in order to receive, like in order for me to hear you, even, right? I need to change to be receptive, to open my heart. I actually had this thing about the two commandments that Jesus gives, right? And like one of them is love God, and then it says love your neighbor with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, right? And it's like, okay, like why heart? Why heart first? Well, heart is opening your heart to something, right? So only then you, if your heart is open, only then you can receive, right? And then your soul needs to be receptive, right? Needs to attune. And then with your mind, with your understanding, right? You can figure out what to do, and then with your conviction you can act from a place of strength, from a place of stability. So what is all that? Well, like that's changing, right? Like that's changing at a fundamental level, right? Like how are you in the world? Like what is the being that you're participating in? And that's change is required to love, right? And it's not only from from the person loving, right? Which in some sense is higher, right? They're representing heaven, I guess, right? Because they're giving, um, and then the person being loved, right? Like they need to receive. Like if they're not receptive, you can give whatever you want. Like there's no communion, there's no healing, there's nothing. Um, I'll go on at the bottom of the page. We have the garden varieties. We went into that a little bit, and I thought the idea of the snake as a psychopomp, right? As the thing, well, introducing change, right? Introducing progression of the story, right? Because you could also argue that without the snake, there's stagnation. Right? We're talking about robots, we're talking about zombies, all that stuff, right? Like how do you get robots and zombies? Well, if there's no snakes. then there's no need to change. If there's no need to change, then we're all stuck, right? And you can also imagine the scenario of ignoring the snake, right? If you just see the snake as part of the garden, and you just keep on dancing with the snake, then you end up corrupting everything, right? Like changes happen, but you're still maintaining the old order that cannot account for the change, right? And then the whole thing will become diseased or poisoned, right? As a consequence. And at a certain point, the body will be unable to live, will cease to be able to function, to be, and then it will fall apart. It will return to dust, which is something we'll get to. But
with respect to the snake thing, it just kind of reminds me of, just the other week when we were talking about the idea of like, the accountants being at the top of the hierarchy, like that type of thing, where it's like those are usually the guys that you hire like more or less last, like once you have everything else kind of on there, like they're almost kind of like a functional ornament. And the same thing with these kind of, like unusual animals and things like the lower little animals and everything, where it's just like, well, what, they're not pulling any farm equipment, like they're not doing any of these other, they're not there to like build stuff or anything like that, but they're more or less kind of just they're like ornamental in a sense. Especially like if they're innocuous, like if you're in a pre-fallen world and you can't get venom from it or anything like that, these things are more or less if they're clever and maybe not particularly smart, or maybe they have some sort of other intention or something like that, but at the end of the day, like the hierarchy needs to be reasserted. So there is that aspect of like proper integration allows for them to exist, but they also can't be allowed to they can't be allowed to get out of hand. And I was thinking about this with respect to this idea of having to like work and preserve the garden or protect the garden. And it's like, oh, well, what danger is there? But you imagine, like, you see some of these ridiculous animal videos, and you think of like those videos of cats. Like, here's an animal that will like throw itself in the trash and then not know how to get out, and it's like, if that thing can't die, that it's just like that it'll be stuck in whatever hole it finds itself in for like 100 years until somebody finds it, just losing its silly little cat mind or whatever. Like, that's this sort of protection or covering forward aspect of like, okay, you got to kind of baby proof for these things that are not going to, they're as pre-rational or irrational as you can possibly get. There's still a necessity to kind of protect people even when there's not mortal danger or something like that.
Yeah, Castle. I mean, accountants make the books look good, right? And they refine the books.
Yeah.
And when you put them in charge, or when you even just allow them more influence than they should have, that's when the problems begin. And so part of wisdom, I think I'll go with wisdom. Part of wisdom is knowing, when to listen to which layers, right? And how to incorporate that, because it's two things. Wisdom's never one thing. It's always at least two. So you shouldn't ignore the accountants, right? Just as you shouldn't ignore the guy on the floor who says, no, this process isn't working. But you also shouldn't put him in charge, because he'll ignore all the larger issues and fix the process, or he'll over refine. And the other thing that came up for me was the way you described, in terms of work. I think revivification is a better way to think about these things. And then the difference is that some, what will we say, non-productive or seemingly non-productive work is required. But the difference between good work and bad work, good work is called revivification, and bad work isn't either required to lay a foundation or set up for a potential, or actively revivifying. And I think if you break the world into those three things, the world of work, we'll say, or the world of action, might be a better way to say it. Then it's probably easier to understand the world in general and engender that wisdom. I mean, you're not you couldn't, even if this were a thing, and it's not, you couldn't hand people wisdom because they have the wrong categories. It won't work anyway. I mean, they might like, if I could hand you wisdom, like just 10 wisdom points or something in a video game, it wouldn't help you much if you have the wrong categories and you're not understanding things like revivification versus work to allow for potential, right, or allow for ordered potential in the future, and work that's bad, like just bad work, like carrying the bag of rice from one side of the camp to the other, or moving the hole, right? Not that there isn't necessarily utility in moving the hole. There can be, right, but in general, it's not a utilitarian thing. They use it in the military to train discipline, obviously, so, and punish people. So work as punishment or action as punishment is certainly not. It's better. It's better than throwing them behind bars. I'll tell you that much. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in case it helps you.
So adding on to the work thing, we're gonna get to it later, but Matthieu Pageau used that word, and in the King James version, it's tilling the ground. What does tilling mean? Well, it's creating place for seeds to be planted, right? And that's related to cultivation. And if you look at work, well, it's a type of work, right? Like now we're talking about domains again, right? Like work is not the proper domain to use there. Like tilling the ground is the proper domain because it's making way for seeds and allowing things to grow. And so when we're talking about revivification, I think that's upkeep, right? That's a different word. Cultivation is allowing things to be established, right? And you can also see destruction as a type of work, right? Like org smash, like we need to get rid of this thing because it's in the way. So yeah, so it's important to realize, okay, like what are these categories pointing to? Are they pointing down? Are they pointing forward? Are they pointing up? And how do you participate with them? And Castle, you gave me an amazing insight just now, right? Because like we're talking about ornamentation, or at least that's coming around, and it's like, well, what if the ornamentation is ugly? Because like what does that mean? Because I think that's what an accountant can be, right? Like if they exceed their proper place or something, they become ugly. They become ugly ornamentations thing. And I think, yeah, non essentialities, right? And so where this brought me is all these people that say beauty will save the world. Because what are they talking about? They're talking about, well, we need to have the right ornamentation. And it's like, well, what are you putting the ornamentation on? Because like, if you're just gonna like throw around ornamentation, like how is it gonna have meaning, even, right? Like even if it is beautiful, like if it's not given a place, right? If it's not in the hierarchy, in a different aspect, contributing to that, it's meaningless. And this is what we're dealing with. All of this art is meaningless because it's no longer connected, right? Or it's connected to the personal experience. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's you, and like you're not God, so like you have the wrong experience, like and and therefore I can't participate with it. And if I do participate with it, then I'll be made in your image, which is like, no, thank you, sorry. Like I got enough problems of my own. I don't need yours. So yeah, like that that is a really interesting way to think about this idea of beauty will save the world.
Yeah, it sort of calls to mind like the pearls before swine thing, where it's just like this thing that maybe you could find a good place for this, but you're just kind of like tossing it. You're not just tossing it out the window or something. You're specifically throwing at something lower that can't possibly integrate it. Yeah, so there is that, and then there's that aspect of like, you can have absolutely too much ornamentation, and then there's an aspect too of trying to over refine arts and ornamentation and stuff. I mean, I think it's something that Mark mentioned that in some TV show episode or something like that of a character that was trying to do a demonstration of music and then compiled all these different types of techniques to present this musical concerto or whatever, and then it was too flat. Everything was done perfectly timed and everything. But recently I've listened to a lot of like kind of classical guitar type stuff and everything, and then you encounter some of these things that are clearly not done by someone who's very good, but they just love doing it, and they haven't properly tuned their guitar like as well as they could for a stage performance or anything like that. The guitar is old, and like you can hear that it's old and that it could probably need some new strings. And every time they hit that note, it doesn't sound the same every time. Like it sounds different every time they do it, actually. And there's something more charming about that. I don't think that it's necessary that it's that way every single time, but there is something to that of trying to over constrain your ornamentation.
Yeah, and I want to you sort of brought this up in a roundabout way, but over focusing on ornamentation, right? Over the thing that you're ornamenting, and the ornamentation comes last after the work is done. That's the purpose of it, right? And so you that's where this celebration is. Celebration is in the ornamentation. That's why you prepare for a party by putting up streamers and stuff, right? And yeah, and then of course by the end of the party, everything's a mess and needs to be cleaned up, and you go right back into the work cycle.
Yeah, I always have my backdrop, and I have a new backdrop, and like it is a living nightmare to navigate this room when it's up, so I have to do it last. I don't know what. Yeah, there you go. It's a tavern. But
you're in a tavern. Excellent.
Yeah, I'm in a tavern.
I love it.
And
so that wasn't digital the whole time?
No, it's fabric. Yeah.
It's his tabernacle.
Yeah. It's so ridiculous.
Reality trumps digital falsity.
Always. Even when you can see that I haven't ironed it or any of those things, I still prefer it. So even when I can't walk 2 feet that way.
Okay. So let me be a good host and start the book club off at actual new content, since we're only an hour in.
I could talk about cosmic words if you want.
Okay. No, I turned the page. Now you can talk, Castle. Go.
Okay. So I just want to quickly make a few associations etymologically with the word. So this thing of like, he says on the previous page, which shall not be seen again, this thing about serpents and trees becoming cosmic words that embody metaphysical truth. So I just want to kind of lay out some associations that words can also mean like a declaration or even a calling or summons of something. And also some of the roots for the word also are related to promise, as we've kind of talked about promises a little bit. And that's a lot of kind of a sending or releasing forward for a mission. But also there's kind of, Greek philosophy is not my toolbox, but I'm kind of thinking a little bit of like the final cause thing. And like just with respect to just kind of like any given thing, including just like an animal that you encounter, and then just kind of realizing like, oh, there's final cause in like, this weird cat that I encountered.
Well, I think we went over it last week, right? But like what is a word? Well, like a word is something that proceeds from a mouth, right? And from a mind, from a will. So it's an expression of something, right? So if we look at like, okay, what is a serpent an expression of, right? Like what is the dominion of serpent? Like what is the dominion of a tree, right? Then we can start truly see, right? Like what is the spiritual dimension of these things that we're talking about, right? Because you could also argue, right? Like how can there be a snake without the dominion of a snake? Right? Like it was really good about Peterson was talking to uh Hitch, no, not Hitch, well, whatever, and they were talking about the idea of a predator, right? And like the predator being a super category, and like is that real, right? And then the idea of a predator was compared to a dragon, right? And now the question is, which of those is more real? Because that's my question, right? Like, is the dragon, the super category dragon, a more accurate representation or predator? And like why do we have predator? Well, predator allows us to biologically capture a subgroup of animals, right? So that would be like an Aristotelian uh, categorization. But dragon is the heavenly principle in which a predator participates in a certain domain, right? And then the question is, well, like which of those do you adhere to? Do you adhere to dragons, or do you adhere to predators, right? And like the problem with predators is that that's a human imposed category for a purpose, right? So to go back to having this idea of having a road that you're following. Well, like why do humans impose the category predator? Well, because they're walking down a path of trying to name the animals instead of
Right. But you have to recognize the error of science in that, right? Predator is not a category, a material category. Predator is a category of final cause or purpose, right? In other words, anything can be a predator, anything. And therefore, it is not an exclusionary category in that way. It's a category based on action, not a category based on makeup or material. And that is where things get confused, because science in the materialism era, or the age of gnosis, as I like to call it, tries to not only make everything a proposition, but reduce all propositions to nouns. And so when you have only nouns to deal with materialism, you start running into these problems. And then you get exactly what you outlined, Manuel, which is a split between, we'll say, the symbolic representation of, that would be dragon, and the scientific, quote, categorization of, but the errors in categorization, not in the, there's nothing wrong with predator in science, so long as you understand it's based on purpose and not based on object. Problem goes away. But make final cause great again, to Castle's excellent point, like that's the big issue with science, is they ignore final cause all the time, and science didn't used to do that. So it's got a big philosophy too, like so-called, quote, modern philosophy, it loses the plot. If your philosophy doesn't account for children, it's not a philosophy. Just throw it out and move on. There's if you're not accounting for children, you're not accounting for any of the interesting things in the world correctly, ever. And you can't. So you need to not do that. It's that simple.
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize that, yes, a predator is characterized by action, a dragon isn't, right? Like, and so the domain of predator is in expression, right? So it's in how something gets given body, and a dragon is by intention or something, or by a way of being, the being that the
predator
dragon
is in expression, not in body. It's in expression, right? Because it's in relationship. So the relationship, when the expression of the relationship is I eat you, then I become a predator. And when the expression of the relationship is reversed, it eats me, then I'm no longer a predator. Nothing's changed except the purpose, except the relationship itself.
And I think you see a lot of that, more of the sort of the stacking of the kind of the circular and then the square kind of over and over again sort of thing. I think of, then you have like counter predators. So it's like you have the thing that would traditionally be preyed upon by a particular category of animal. And then you have, like those super tiny mice that hunt scorpions 3 times their size or whatever. You get, like, when I was a kid, I would go to this little wildlife conservatory thing, and they had a few animals that I used to like to kind of hang out and play with. And one of them was a California king snake. And super docile animal. But the thing is, they eat rattlesnakes. And interestingly, the California king snakes don't have venom. So you have the sort of like, there's the more stable, sort of less time-like version of the snake. They even call it a king. He's like, the naming is pretty apt, and not just for the fact that it eats a lot of other snakes, but it's actively not a predator to most other animals. Like it's specifically a snake that is like just really good at eating other snakes.
So I want to go to the diagrams, and above it says the river went out from Eden to the waters, the garden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 heads, right? So like it's not really visible in there, but it's 1 becoming 4, right? Like there's a mutation in the ending up in the garden, right? So the garden is doing something, and then so the rivers are like snakes in the land, right? They're on the ground, they creep really crawly things, and the snake is actually one of those that gets its own will, right, and can escape the confinements of of the ground by going up the tree. So then it's interesting. So he's talking about the 4 rivers and the 4 cardinal directions that I assume that are associated with that, but also 4 heads, right? So those rivers, they speak, or that, and they speak with water. Like the water flows out of them, right? So they are feeding, right? Like what do rivers do? Where they water the land so that things can grow. So in some sense they're speaking life into being out of the garden, like whatever that means, right? But that's an interesting way to look at that, right? And so they're a source of renewal for the land as well, right? Because they're not constant in the way that they're contributing, right? They're manifesting differently throughout the seasons, all of that stuff.
Well, I'm seeing, the sort of same pattern. Of course, we're going to, as was kind of established here, we are in the self-similar fractal part of the book, and it's probably only uphill from here. But just pointing out that the diagram here on the left side, there are the 4 rivers. I'm also seeing the same sort of thing. If you have the single unity of kind of, there's the source of water, and then you have the differentiation for like the pattern of, you've got the 4 cardinal directions, and you have these 4 different rivers that are flowing out into everything. And then you have all of the other manifestations of streams and rivers and all these other little things that are supposed to kind of sprout out or branch out from this sort of thing. So you're seeing a lot of like the same, when we talked last week about the self-similar structure of trees. It's just kind of it's always kind of branching out, and everything is also kind of happening in this manifestation.
Yes, but these are ordered in a sense, right? Like that. But yeah, like I like, so you could also see it as the roots of a tree, right? Because that's kind of what it does, right? It's like from the garden down and out.
With the self-similar fractality type thing, this looking backwards, the diagram here with the 4 rivers and the 4 directions kind of harkens back to Ezekiel with the 4 cherubs,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well,
I mean,
actually, Ezekiel's later, right? So Ezekiel's maybe referencing this.
Yeah.
well,
Well,
you've
he's
got
saying
like
harkening
we're
back to our
talking about
discussion
rivers
on.
and cherubs,
Yeah. No,
right?
I
Yeah,
agree.
we've
I'm
got
just
yeah,
like I think Ezekiel is actually going to the level of humanness, right? In some sense of wow, but he's also going up. I don't know.
yeah.
Like that story is real. Like I read it last week and it's just like, oh my God. Like, but yeah, it's the same pattern for sure. Yes.
Something else kind of popped up for me. We talked about, especially since Halloween was approaching and everything. We talked about grotesques and we talked about gargoyles and those sorts of things, and that the water on the roof is actually meant to kind of go around them and to kind of flow out from around them. So there is also a little bit of that aspect, especially because it's a walled garden. There is a bit of this kind of gargoyle aspect to the garden itself, but then also with the cherubim kind of out there guarding the outside of the garden, especially after the fall. You do have this kind of the psychopomp as geography, and then kind of like as office, and there's a lot of that kind of happening there that I'm seeing.
I think it's also worth mentioning that rivers in general don't split apart very often. Like that just doesn't tend to happen very much. Like some exceptional circumstances, maybe in like deltas, like the Nile, they like kind of split apart, but generally doesn't happen. Rivers tend to coalesce, and it's also rivers are a kind of symbol of changeability, yeah, because they change through the seasons. They sometimes overflow. They change their course, but in general, I think they are a they give a sense of consistency, because where else can you get water consistently at the surface? Like pretty much nowhere. You have to wait for rain, or you can like dig a well or something. But a river is something that you can return to. It'll be there in 100 years. People build cities next to them. They're great for that. And I think in general, a really good image that a river is a good image of, for example, a church, because you have this hierarchy and you have this subsidiarity, because rivers have multiple different what do you call them, like
Sources.
multiple different sources, multiple different streams, and each of them also has its own identity. So for example, the Rhine River has the Moselle and the Meuse, I think, or whatever. Like there's a bunch of them, and each of those areas has its own kind of sub identity, and then they kind of coalesce into this one bigger area. And it's similar for a church or some other kind of hierarchy, where the lower, smaller units feed the larger one, and then they kind of unify in the end, usually in some larger city or something.
Yeah, because that's a different level, right? Human interaction with the river, because that's a whole
Yeah.
can of worms to treat the worm with a head. It's like, yeah, like maybe that's a better, right? Like rivers are like worms, maybe not as snakes, because they're not that snaky. They're not poisonous in that manner. Um, so if we go back to the second Bible quote there, God took human the human and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and preserve it, right? So now he changed two words, at least in relationship to the King James. And so the King James says to dress instead of to work, right? So this is interesting because they're both naked, right? But they're dressing the garden, and they get dressed by God when they leave the garden. Um, so the dressing is making of skin, right? Uh, and you could say that also that is a decoration, right? To dress something, to dress the table, right? Like it allows for certain participation. And then the second word is preservation, and in the King James it says keeping. So that's maintenance, right? So to keep something is neutral. To preserve means that you're keeping it from something instead of keeping it for its own sake in some sense. So yeah, or you're keeping it for something, right? To preserve something is that you have a later purpose for it, that it's not participating. So it's interesting to see the connotations of these words and the implications of the usage of these words. And I'm going to go with the King James over Matthieu on this one.
It's interesting because there's a lot of overlaps, right, with the implications. So like with keep, like you can also think of like a fortress. Like a lot of fortresses were called such and such keep or something like that, and like those kind of performed the aspect of like you keep something for a purpose, you keep things in, you keep things out, that type of thing. But so there is a lot of that there. I like the circumambulation of using multiple translations because you can. I just really like the way some people kind of interpreted it and just saying like, oh, you can get a much more complete picture from it.
Okay, so here's the etymology of keep is to seize, to take in. This is the integration part, actually. To care for and to attend to.
Right, because in the enchanted world, those are all the same thing and inseparable. And when you get into the scientific realm, they're not. It's like, no, you can't keep something without protecting it, right? And you can't protect something without taking it. Like these are impossible combinations to split apart and remake the world with. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the inability of science to use language in a valid fashion sometimes, and they get confused with categorization and predator. It's the same sort of a problem where you think keep is to have or something. It's like no, bro, like you can't reduce it that way. It's got a multi-aspectual set of relationships to it that define it in a way that these certain things go together and they can't be split apart because you can't do one without the other, right? Or the other three or whatever it is, right? And that's hard. It's hard to understand. I get it, but also that's the better way to understand the world. And once you see it, everything becomes clear, and it's much easier to function once everything becomes clear.
I think in a much previous conversation, we kind of ran into a similar thing where we were discussing. I think it was like faith, hope, and trust, or something like that. And this aspect of like, you can examine them very much, but like actually in practice, like they're so overlapping that it's almost like unnecessary to even try to differentiate them.
Oh, so it's interesting because there's another word. So it says put in instead of placed, and to put etymologies to push to trust, right? So to go back to Heidegger, thrownness, they're thrown into the garden.
I will never forgive you for that, just to let you know.
But it's interesting, right? Like the fact that I make a joke about that. It's like, okay, so why are we talking about Heidegger and not about Genesis 2? Like
Well placed, sir.
Yeah, so you can see that when we're reading at the bottom of the page, right, that the introduction of water, which also corrodes, right? Like you also have to imagine that, like, so, and also like that corrosion is taking things from the source, right, downstream, down the river, right, and also like these things sometimes contribute to the landscape, right? Like they get sediment, it gets settled. Um, um, and in some sense that is also the thing that happens to man, right? Like they get corroded from the garden, and they get taken with the streams into exile, right? And just like with sand from the mountain that goes through the river, right? Like they can't go back, right? Like that's the no return. They're exiled from the mountain. Yeah, is everybody complete on this page? Okay, then we'll go to this other diagram, which is has a bunch of implications that I still need to figure out. So if someone else wants to start.
I don't know. I was thinking with you have the snake on the tree there in the middle as the mediator type thing space. That reminded me of Moses with the bronze serpent in the desert there, which was also the image of Jesus on the cross. So
There's, I mean, the association is 100% there, and I want to point out also this sort of this implied third element of each of these. So you have the image of the flooded land, and then you have it saying that time mediates. Then you have the dry land, and it says space mediates. And then in the center, it has a garden, and it says Adam mediates. Like Adam is not in the picture; he's mediating it. Like he's elsewhere doing his job. But you're just kind of getting that little aspect of. I just want to highlight that. I guess just for the folks at home, I guess that a lot of these diagrams that we have are not just showing the thing that is actually in the diagram, but if you only see two things, there's a third one, like always kind of creeping around the corner. And it's important to know what that one is, and then what the implications of that are.
Yeah, I like that. I like that you made that differentiation, Castle. I mean, for me, the implication here is that this is the human or Adam perspective, right? Where he sees all three of these broken out like this, we'll say, right? He sees all the dominions. And because he sees all the dominions, he is the mediator. And so he sees, from outside, it's not really outside, right? Because you're not outside of creation, but he sees these dominions and his role in the potential manifestation, which is the garden, right? And that's your third thing for sure. And that's why we'll say sciencey people are confused about objective material reality, because they think that that is representative of a state rather than being representative of, we'll say, the human perspective from within creation, right? Because you're still never outside of creation. That's not, like, you can't do that. Back to Thronos. Yeah, it's like, duh. Yeah, you can't do that. It's too late. Like, it's not. You're never. They're not going to be you ever. They're not going to have been you ever, right? So just don't worry about it. Just look at where you can mediate and mediate away.
So I want to reintroduce the ideas of dressing and keeping into the diagram, right? So on the left hand side we have preserving, right? But if you look at if replace that with dressing, right? So natural change needs to be dressed, right? Just like if you have a savage, you clothe them, right? You give them a cultivation. You give them a means of sheltering their nature, like mediating the nature and the participation, right? It's containing that which is within, constraining, right? And so a different word you could use there is addressing, right? So you need to address nature, like like it comes up, and you need to deal with it. You need to address the problem or the change, right? Like now I make the same mistake. Like I put it in a problem. No, it's just change. And the way that we deal with the change makes it either a problem or we just address it. So that's the one hand, right? So this is just the eternal bubbling up of things from below, right? And then the second part is to keep, right? Or to maintain, right? So we have established things, we have accomplished things, and we like to keep them. We like to hold on to them, right? So there's a stability that we want to maintain, we want to uphold. And so this is something that is imposed, right? Like it's artificial, it's said, right? And it affords certain things, right? You can just look at a house, for example, right? Like that's the stability that allows you to stay warm and to have protection from animals and whatever, right? So the natural change, right, uh, is kept at bay, right? Just like with actual clothing, right? The actual clothing is keeping the interference of the cold or heat at a bay, so that you can maintain more functionality across more domains of participation. And so both of these things are ever present, right? And they are ever present demands, right? So to look at the garden, right, is then where they come together, right? Like so the garden has this natural aspect, and it also has the cultivated aspect, right? Like plants grow in your garden, weeds grow in your garden. Like you need to address the weeds, and you also want to make it beautiful, right? You want to get fruits from it or something, right? So there's also a intention. It's a dominion, right? Like it's the imposition of your will on the garden.
So I want to address dressing and addressing. So this thing about I'm kind of looking at it here. It's a keeping straight, but then also separating apart. And so this aspect of it is very much a straightening out, but it's also straightening out by division in a certain sense. So it kind of reminded me of, if you have, like, you take somebody that has like really long hair or curly hair or something like that, and they wake up with like bedhead, and it's just the hair is all over the place and everything, and their hair is all tangled up. In order to straighten that out, you actually have to separate the tangles. And thinking about here on this page here, there's this aspect of, there's a minimum of preservation, or addressing, like the amount of things you have to address and how severely you have to address them is extremely minimal when the equilibrium is present. And that sort of thing, of depending on just how messed up, I can only imagine like some things that barbers probably have to encounter, and that you see some people spend like 3 or 4 hours or something like that at these places. And it's like, oh, well, how do you address that? It's like there's an enormous amount of straightening out that has to be done. There's a ton of separating that has to be done. And the more severe it is, the more water you have to use, or solvents or whatever sort of chemicals you need. Like there's a lot of additional kind of implements that are required in order to kind of do this, depending on how messed up the equilibrium is. So I just want to kind of give a silly example of like everyday life, how that plays out.
Yeah, I got called out, so I'm gonna have to respond. So, well, what is this mythological garden, right? Like, the question is, does it exist? Well, if that's the way that things flow, like literally, right? Like we're talking about rivers that flow, right? So if that is the flow of being, and that is an accurate description of the flow of being, like it in some sense it doesn't exist. It is a prerequisite for existence. So you can take your exist and you can put it wherever you want to. Like
that was well said, Manuel. Yeah, I also want to point out that these same people will regularly place either within existence or within reality thoughts, and I'm like, well, you're not going to have material correspondence and measurement for thoughts, so you're perfectly okay when it's something to do with you personally because you have a brain and you think, I think, therefore I am, right? Whatever. But you're not happy about that. We'll call it ethereal or non-materially corresponding or measurable thing. So you're going to have to resolve that for me because I don't think you can. I think you're picking and choosing what standards you're using and applying and when and where. And I mean, in the one sense, it really doesn't matter. In the other sense, Castle's correct. Yes. And in the third sense, there is archaeological evidence for this. So I don't know what your standard of evidence is, Dawkins, but like we have it. Like I don't. At what point do you give up, right? Because I think I pointed this out before. The more we look for, we'll say, a material correspondence to the Bible, the more we actually find. That might be a hint. That might be a hint that you can find this in, we'll call it material reality pretty easily when you start looking.
And you can, if we go back to the graph, right? Like what's Dawkins doing? Well, he's trying to approach everything from the domain of artificial stability. Like, okay, like, well, does the garden exist in artificial stability? No, it doesn't, because it's a combination of natural change and artificial stability. So, like, no, like it doesn't exist over there, but that's not where life is. Like, because we'll get into life later.
That's a good point, Manuel. Yeah, I mean, the problem of science is the problem of artificial stability trying to understand natural change. That's a good way to frame it. Like, yeah, and the problem is you don't start obviously from artificial stability. You start from natural change, right? And that's how you get artificial stability. And there, that problem solved. Like science is just trying to do things it can't do. Like, over and over again. See my channel. Like I talk about this all over the place.
I'd like to just make a quick comment as well about like manifestation of certain things. So if you have like, I'd like to just use I like my silly examples. Thinking of this thing of artificial stability. If you use the example of say like the Sydney Opera House or something like that, very recognizable. Most people have seen this. And if there's some sort of minor repair, I'm pretty sure that they had a fire in there at one point. There was a lot of things that had to be rebuilt. That if you had something like that, like it's still the Sydney Opera House, even if you have to replace most of the wood planks and half of the building or something like that, you still have the blueprints. You can still maybe even alter some of the insides of the stuff, repurpose some rooms, stuff like that. Now, if by malevolence and or gross incompetence, I blew up the Sydney Opera House, and you don't have it. It no longer exists. It doesn't stand out from the blueprint, the abstraction of the heavenly super Sydney Opera House. It can still be remanifested if there's someone competent and committed enough to remanifest it. And when it's rebuilt, if you actually did that, it would still be the Sydney Opera House. Like that would still be the case. Like the United States White House is not, as it is right now, is not the same White House that they had the first time they built a White House. But it was still the White House, and it's still the White House now. Like it's not an imitation or anything like that. It's still the White House.
Yeah, so I guess we'll do the follow-up. The soul is already in the intelligible realm, and sin was a movement to the like Adam is placed there, right? Like we have to realize what the domain is that we're talking, right? So you can talk from the perspective of God, right? And he's basically saying, well, I created this garden, and like Adam it gets placed in it, right? And everything is right if he does as commanded, right? You can look from it from the perspective of Adam, right? And he doesn't have a complete anything, right? Like he just has the trees that he gets to eat from, right? And then he gets to not eat from one tree because God said so. Right? Like that's literally what it is. So what are these trees? Well, these trees are things that come from the earth, right? And then go back down from heaven, right? Like because the fruits are above you, right? So you reach up and you take heavenly fruits. And so like that is, if you're talking about no sin, like that's the correct relationship, right? So yes, that's not sin. And like I was talking with Gustav later, like how does he get cursed? He has to work the ground. He has to eat the things from the ground. He has to plant the seeds, all of the things, right? So the relationship from the things of above gets corrupted as a consequence of trying to be above, right? Because that's eating from the tree of knowledge, good and bad. And as a consequence, now you are above, right? You've placed yourself above, like God acknowledges that, like he is like me, right? Like you are like a God. And so if you are like a God, then your relationship changes. Your relationship with reality changes, and now you got responsibility. Like you got different responsibility than the keeping, right? In you are ruling instead of keeping, and ruling is a different game. To use this stupid word, rule is a different office. There we go. Fixed. The rule has different rules. There, fixed.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, this is what people get confused with scale. Right? Scale is very confusing people. Scale is where you have the same pattern, but different manifestations or different rules, right? And so the principles haven't changed, right? But the way you implement them has. And so it might not be appropriate to allow a sitting president to be dragged into court week after week after week. And so, unlike other citizens, you can't just arbitrarily sue the president. Right. Doesn't mean you can't sue the president. It means that the rules are slightly changed. You can sue him when he's out of office, right? Because you don't want anybody to weaponize the court system in that way while he's a sitting president, right? Like that's things. We're operating at a different scale because the president's scale is technically higher than the average citizen by definition. Like that's what it means to hold that office. But also I would warn against theologically. Just throw that out. Theologies, no, don't try to do theology. It's a mistake. Leave that to theologians, and you're not one. Again, there appears by all the archaeological evidence that's available that there is a place that matches the description of the Garden of Eden in, we'll call it the material realm or something. And while I don't, I'm not going to throw out this idea of original sin was a movement to the material realm. It's an oversimplification for sure, even if that's an accurate description, and I actually don't think it is. You know, the thing that gets you thrown out is thinking, right? It's knowledge. That's what gets you thrown out of the garden. Sorry, right? Because it increases your understanding and interaction and participation in the world, but not towards the higher. And that's the problem with the fruit of knowledge, right? So it's not like the sin is sort of aimed at materiality, but it might be fair to say that the sin is aimed at capturing material inappropriately. That might be a better way to think about it, but I think that's way too oversimplified, and but I'm not ready to throw it out wholesale yet. I'd have to think about that a lot longer, I think, before I could go along with original sin being a movement to the material realm. I mean, it's definitely not, because they're already in the material realm, right? To some extent, the rules are already there, and they're like, gravity still exists, right? And so, you know, gravity. If a tree falls on you, you'll get hurt. Like these things still are still there, right? And you know, they're not what we'll say curses or changes to the world. They're just consequences of being able to be in a world, or thrownness, if you hate Heidegger. You know, and that's important to realize, is that there is an interaction that, like, the creation already had rules and limitations. Otherwise, you couldn't discern it from creator, right? And so that differentiation, plus our free will, is it creates a more varied set of combinations than you know, for the creator to enjoy, we'll say, than was there before, or something. You can't really capture it in language, but gonna do my sloppy job anyway.
Well,
I think I think I will rebel slightly against Mark here and say that theologically the garden is not a place where there is no sin, but it's a place where there's potential for sin.
That on a theological basis, so far as I understand theology, that would be correct. Also, never do theology.
I have a comment on something that Manuel said, and I have a comment on something that Mark said, just to kind of buttress the points that were made. So one of them, this thing of being like something, and then that related to scale. So I've been thinking a bit, especially this week, about kind of the old-fashioned use of the word like. So this thing of, you know, people say, oh, you know, I like this on there, or I am like this, or something like that. And thinking about how people would often, especially within the context of saying that, oh, I like this, you know, this food or this color or this, you know, clothing or something like that, that they would traditionally say, this thing likes me. If it was something scaled below your level, below your office, it would like you, because like is related to having similar characteristics or suiting something, to the point about dressing. So this thing, you know, this thing is a dressing for me, or this thing suits me. Whereas if something's larger than you, you'd say, you know, I like the organization I'm a part of, or something like that. I have maybe been informed by, or I've taken on some of the qualities of this organization that I'm part of. Ideally, if you like a place, then you're not rebelling against it constantly, you know, and if they have a dress code, you're not doing something completely insane every single time. And so just kind of that aspect of the scale definitely changes. So when you're looking down, then the things should rightly be ordered upwards towards you if you're looking down, and then if you're looking up, then it shouldn't necessarily be the same way from your kind of looking out. And then this thing about thinking leading to exile, I just wanted to kind of also add to my analogy that I used about like a musical performance or something like that. That if you're going and you have somebody, you know, you take like a kid that's doing a recital, and they have, you know, they've noodled about on the instrument before they knew anything, and they thought, okay, I want to take this up. They did the scales, they did the practice and everything. Now they're doing the recital. The thing that knocks them off track is if they start thinking about their fingers too much. They start thinking about the notes that are coming up, what sort of procedures are supposed to be coming up. It needs to be a continuous thing. Even if they make a mistake, the less they think about the particularities of the performance, the more likely they are to actually succeed at it. And the more you wind up thinking about it and not just letting the things properly flow if you have good practice, the more embarrassed, maybe even you have the fear of being laughed off stage, like literally being exiled by the audience, just from your overthinking.
So I have a question in relation to that, if it's okay for me to ask. If thinking is being exiled from the garden, what would be its return? What would be our return to it?
Jesus. There.
You could use the highest possible example, but so it's something like continuous participation, like in the case of like the musical thing, then it isn't good to be thinking about every single note. It's good to do that when you're learning and you're integrating these things, but also thinking like in a martial arts context or something, like you should be thinking about, oh, is my elbow properly rotated or something like that in like a competition. And it's like, no, it should be, if you're thinking about that, the other guy beat you. Like you're already on the ground. That's what happened. But it should be something where you are fully participating. All of the procedures have kind of fallen below, that you're no longer liking the procedures, they're liking you, and then you're participating in the actual event, whatever it is. So the other things are still there. Like the thoughts happened, maybe maybe they didn't happen by you. Like maybe maybe Mr. Miyagi already thought about the practice he was going to give you, and all you needed to know is waxing on and waxing off or something like that, and then you can just like, oh, I just apply this, so like maybe sometimes the thought is done for you and you don't have to worry about it.
Another way to look at this is to say, okay, you're not in the garden anymore, right? Like that's the story. That's what happened. And so what you should do is participate in a way that you get back there, right? Or that you have the potential to get back there or something. And that's another way to look at it. And then that gives you an easy handle on what's going on. And then if you need a guidebook, they're out there. So those are wisdom texts.
So I'll just read something quickly from my notes from a YouTube video titled "Deconstructing the Fall of Adam and Eve." It's a Jonathan Pageau talk, which, by the way, the guys in the comments, there's a lot of things in the comments. You guys should check that out. We covered this a long time ago. YouTube video is called "Deconstructing the Fall of Adam and Eve" by Jonathan Pageau. But number one, this is a disconnected statement. We understand self-sacrifice as the manner in which we hold things together. But two, and directly related to the idea of exile, and this is Jonathan Pageau, probably a paraphrase, hell is when you break down and that breakdown becomes permanent. Death is like a way out. It makes it possible for you to change. Every time you sin, you misalign your point and you suffer. Every time you do something bad, like lie and suffer the consequences, it's an opportunity to change. If I were to freeze you in your sin, that's hell. Someone who's lost the capacity for repentance, like, for example, someone who's obsessed, someone who is completely taken up in passion and is living in a cycle of desire and consumption, that's the idea of hell. So much more could be said, but I remember hearing the things phrased in that way being useful. So it's not. I mean, I think there are other aspects of the idea of exile. This also goes back to chapter 2, which, as Christopher was talking, my notes would work. It's in Language of Creation, chapter 2. At the end of the chapter, it says the narratives of the Bible are about humanity's conflicted attempts to reconcile spiritual truth with physical reality in the hopes of acquiring divine knowledge. So one thing I was thinking about when I heard Reflective Journeys Dawkins' question is like, what is even your idea of, if you don't have eyes to see, which is in the diagram on chapter 2, or a spiritual perspective, what even is this idea of being exiled? Like, if you have no friends and have no money, that is not being exiled. Like, you're not an exile. You're just like, maybe you're sad or maybe you're like down on consequences, right? Being exiled is a spiritual condition, right? And so in order to even think in those terms, it challenges like the utilitarian nature of looking at narrative or a question like that. I'll just leave it at that.
I would say, Danny, rather, those two things are attached. You can't be physically exiled without being spiritually exiled. And if you're spiritually exiled, you're physically exiled. You can't separate the worlds, right? I mean, this is when John Vervaeke talks about this. he's very close, right? He says we can't live in a two worlds mythology. Yeah, we don't, but whatever, right? Because yeah, you can't pick one or the other, and you can't go between them because there's not two of them. That's not right. It's more like we're tying together two aspects, right? That was that well, that's all over this chapter. This is taking two things and making a third thing, not in the Hegelian sense, because Hegel was a retard and just throw out all his work, you'll be happier, right? This is where we're in the middle of it. It's not synthesis, antithesis, nonsense. No, it's not higher. It's where we are, right? Like the horizontal path is the vertical causality. I know we always do it horizontally, but it's actually vertical causality that we're bringing together. You could talk about that in other terms. Maybe familiar Christian language might be bringing together heaven and earth. Hopefully people saw that before I said it, right? Like that's what's happening, and that's what's creating the verticality as such. Like the union of the top and the bottom spreads out and creates the horizontal, and that's where we are. But what that means is everything in the horizontal has an ethereal and material aspect. Everything. They are unavoidably connected through us. Like that's actually how everything works.
I want to point back a little bit about what's the answer to the fall: faith, hope, and love. Right. So what is hope? Right. Like that's the promise. Like that's something to aim at. Faith is your adherence to the hope, to stay true to the promise, and love is your participation, right? Your execution of your faith. You're making it manifest, and all of this, and we can go back to what's happening on the page, right? Like the last sentence is maintaining the equilibrium in the garden provided Adam with the knowledge of God as the creator of heaven, earth, space, and time, right? Like, I would
just let me just poke in here, Manuel, real quick before you go too far. Knowledge is in biblical knowledge is in participation, right? I mean, we've been over this in a previous, right? Like to know your wife is not some sexual perversion or sexual reference at all. It's you participate with that person every day, and that's how you know them. You don't know them by asking them questions and doing their big five personality bullshit, right? You know them by hanging out with them and talking to them and being with them and watching them move and moving with them, dancing, whatever, all kinds of things. That's the type of knowledge we're talking about here. In Vervaeke speak, he might call it participatory knowledge. I've got my qualms about that, but like that's the type of knowing. So I wanted to make that clear because people always get knowing in the age of gnosis where we confuse knowledge for propositions. People always get that confused.
Yeah, so I was also struggling with this line because I found it a bold statement, and I was like, no, it's the knowledge from God. It's not of God. It's from. And that fixes a whole lot of things. Because if you're saying of, okay, thank you. So if you say of, right, that means that you received something, right, or you can take it with you, or whatever. No, like you need to drink from it, right? Like it's a continual sustenance, and so that.
Yeah, you need to dance with it, maybe.
Yes, and so that's what faith is, right? Like faith is staying in that stream, like staying in the dance, keeping the tune, like all of these things. Only if you're attuned, then you can know God. And if you miss attuned, in other words, you sin, you missed, right? Then that makes you fall, right? Like literally when you're dancing, like that happens. Like if you do a somewhat complex dance, right, or you can do a martial art, right? Like if you sin, you die, right? Like you just get killed because the other guy just beats your ass. So, like that's real, right? Like we get to experience that directly. Only the problem is, right? Like we don't see the stakes. right? Like we can't really see the implications, right? And this is why I was talking about the perspective of Adam, right? It's like, oh yeah, don't eat from that tree, and he's like, well, okay, I guess, right? Cause he doesn't know, he doesn't know. Like he hasn't participated in falling yet. Just like everybody hasn't participated in falling yet until they walk into the wall or they trust an authority that says don't do that, and then they don't do it. Right? And like this is, I was talking a couple of weeks back about like don't open certain doors, right? Like that's what that is. Like you have to trust the authority not to open the door, because else you'll fall, and then you'll learn stuff. But also, like you don't have to. like don't do the thing that you don't have to do.
I'd like
And
to. Oh, please.
yeah, I'll throw it back to you because I wanted to respond to the liking bit because I liked it. And things like I like, right? So I like is sameness, right? And in Dutch we have the word gelijk, which means to be right, right? And you can even go to the court and receive your gelijk, or to take it from there, right? So you can be justified in being right, right? And so yeah, so there's I think the other English word would be kind, right? Like of a kind. And so you can say, right, like for example, if you're a centurion in the Roman army, right? People below you are of your kind, right? They participate in your name, and you are responsible for that, right? So they're likened to you. they're they're all alike in that manner, right? And you're bestowing your likeness onto them. Um, and so you can see the directionality of the likeness and the author, right? And then we go to the name, right? Because if we act in someone's name, right, we act alike to to them. And I was actually in the shower earlier, and I was thinking about citizen arrest, right? And it's like in the name of the law, I arrest you, right? I was thinking like, is this even possible anymore? Right? Like, does that authority get recognized, right? Like, can I speak for the law? Because in and yeah, like it's really important to realize the function of a name, right? Because that's when you use a name, you're likening things to that name.
Yeah, or invoking that name, right? Maybe through action and not through speech. But yeah, those are good points.
Yeah, I was thinking about this aspect that Danny mentioned. Actually, I hadn't seen the video that he referenced, and I do think that a lot of the concepts that you kind of cursorily mentioned would be very helpful to a lot of the people who are in the comment section. And one of the things that I really liked about that is the exile aspect of, like if you're being freezed in your sin, or you're missing the mark, or whatever sort of thing, and this importance of, okay, sure, it's not good to go and go and reaching for the knowledge and this sort of thing of, oh, I'm going to go and acquire all these different things. But if it's already happened to you, then there is an aspect of getting back to that place, or getting to, whatever the fulfillment of the promise of whatever it is. That there is an aspect of kind of leaning into it, the sort of surrender or death, if you would, this kind of loss of control to, and there's very much a death of like, oh, if you've ever practiced scales, like there's a depth to that. You know, like I would probably, in many times, especially as a kid, like I would rather die than practice scales, you know, for music or something like that. But there is an importance of just kind of accepting that if you're going to have to address some sort of issue sooner or later, like you know, the time is going to run out. Like there's going to come a point where you know you have to, you know, time will run out that you didn't get rid of the trash or you didn't properly revivify or some sort of thing like that. There are going to be consequences. Like I think Mark mentioned, like some people that he knew got sick because they didn't take out the trash at one point in this thing of like it's necessary to kind of revivify, to undergo that death of okay, yes, it sucks that I have to take out trash or whatever and do these things. And I was thinking about this a lot recently, actually, within respect of today is All Souls Day. So I was thinking about purgatory a bit and this aspect of like, you know, it's not a permanent place by any means. Like it is this kind of transitional third state sort of thing. And it's leaning towards like the good state, but also there's this aspect of, okay, you no longer have the advantage of death. Like you no longer have the advantage of, okay, I can say if you're not in prison versus you go to prison for something. You go to prison because you owed a debt, you stole money or something like that. Versus, okay, you accidentally lost money and it's now going to be taken out of your paycheck. You're going to have to pay for it. You're going to have to make up for it, pay that back or whatever. You have a lot of advantages when you're not in jail. But if you're already in jail, you got to serve the time. And it's like there's a big difference there. I would much rather be free, but then still kind of like enslaved and having to go and pay off my debt for mistakes I made or for infractions than this aspect of, okay, like you're going to get out eventually, you know, but also you're locked in, you know, and it's going to take as long as it takes. And it's like you can, there's a really big disadvantage to not taking advantage of the disadvantages that come along with exile.
Yeah, let's try and land the plane because we're moving really fast, like a real plane. But to be fair, we were like a real plane, covering a lot of ground from a high vantage point. So I think that ground covered will be allowing us to move faster through the coming chapters because somewhat of a repeat. But to go back right to this mediative role, right, of the change and the stability, right, and you can connect that to faith, hope, love, right? You can see it as something that brings glory, that brings meaning that you get to participate in. You can also look at it as a cross, as something that weighs on you, as a yoke, as a prison, right? Like, or even as an exile from final participation, right? Like, so there's a lot of things that we bring to the idea of the garden, or not being in the garden, right? Like is being outside of the garden an opportunity to return to the garden, with more full awareness of the ways that you can fall, uh, or is it an exile, right? And a denial of that which is rightfully yours or something, right? And now we end up in resentment, right? And embitterment. I was like, okay, like there's all of these people that are contributing to keeping me outside of the garden, and not allowing me to partake in that which is promised to me, right? Because like that's the other thing, right? Like there's a promise, right? But a promise doesn't need to be fulfilled. like if you break the rules, like maybe I'm not going to give you your present on your birthday. Like, like who knows? Even though I promised you to give you your present, because there's higher things, right? There's and so um, and to go back to the idea of course, right? I think that's what the course is, right? Like it's a breaking of establishment, and and I was like, well, yeah, like what do we do now, right? Like I didn't give you your present for your birthday. Do we give it to you next year? Because like how do I resolve that? Right? And that needs to be reconciled. That relationship, right? Like that needs to be redeemed in some manner, and it's not obvious how that works, right? Like how to go about that. But these are probably patterns that we'll get into, um, and we will move into our reflection. I'm gonna ask someone to give a perspective, a frame, a purpose that we can use in our reflection. Does anybody have a suggestion?
Sure. Self-similar fracticality, right? Because it's sort of the theme, and how that how that relates, right, to where you are, and it's all right there.
Right. So in some sense, our participation in that self-similar fracticality. And I'm going to invite everybody to have like a minute of reflection on this. Also, the people in watching on the YouTubes. Please leave questions and insights and share them with us. And we'll talk about our conclusions afterwards. And I hope you'll participate. So we can slowly return. Who had some insight that they wanted to share? I can start it off. So I was thinking about the multiple perspectives that happen upon a fractal layer, right? So you have one from above, one from within, and one from below, and they're all important and necessary, and they come together. And talking about our participation, right? It's like they all need to be accounted for in some manner, right? Like something needs to take the top, the middle, and the bottom, and just recognizing that that's there, and where you're situated, and what those requirements are, right? So you could just do the bare minimum of top, middle, bottom, but you can also give it more flash, right? You can say, well, like in order to be the middle, right, I can be the heart or the arm or whatever, right? I don't know how you want to divide that up, but that gives you a means of locating yourself, right? Grounding yourself in the participation, and it also requires, well, it allows you to give over, right? Surrender, um, because as the head, you can't account for what the feet are doing. Like that's ridiculous. And you shouldn't worry about what the head is doing when you're the feet, because that's ridiculous. And so recognizing that you're corrupting your relationship if you're trying to do that, and that you're actually falling when you're doing that, and you're making the bigger body fall. Uh, and in the opposite direction, like, okay, like if you truly understood your place, what would be possible? What are the things you're not seeing? Why aren't you looking for those? Um, how are you looking for those? Because I think that's kind of like what we were reflecting upon. So yeah, and I think that's gonna be my intention for the week as well, right? Like, okay, like see these things in my participation. So whoever wants to follow that can go.
So I guess I wasn't thinking directly on similar practicality, but I was thinking about dominion as being, there's a lot of dominion implicitly of things implicitly as they manifest. The dominion of things implicitly manifests itself in what you put your attention on. I was thinking about that nature, like the idea of Peterson saying, if you don't control your attention, whose attention is it? And this answer to the question of exile, um, of the components that we listed with faith, hope, and love, there's a confession, completor. It's said in the Lutheran Church and some Catholic masses, but part of it goes, I have sinned in thought, word, and deed. And a similar theme exists in other traditions too, but this idea of like thought, word, and deed as being important components of, I guess important components of finding that you are in exile, and then part of the solution. What we'll say, I'll just leave it at that. But those are some things that came to mind.
Well, and I want to thank everybody for watching, and leave your comments, like, subscribe even, and hope to see you all next week. And come and participate if you want to.